Picture this. It's a warm spring morning in ancient Rome, around 58 years before Christ. The bustling streets of the Eternal City are alive with merchants hawking their wares, senators hurrying to the forum in their pristine togas, and citizens going about their daily lives. They have no idea that walking among them is a man whose ambition will soon shatter everything they hold sacred. One man's relentless hunger for power was about to bring down the foundations of a 500-year-old republic. His name, Gaius Julius Caesar, general, conqueror, politician, and ultimately the architect of Rome's greatest transformation. But here's what's truly fascinating. Caesar wasn't born into ultimate power. He wasn't handed the keys to the empire on a silver platter. So how did this young patrician from a once noble but politically faded dynasty claw his way to the very top? How did he become history's most famous dictator? Was it pure genius? Was it incredible luck? Or was it simply sheer, breathtaking audacity? You see, Caesar's story isn't just about one man's rise to power, it's about the death of an entire way of life. For 5 centuries, Rome had been governed by the Senate and the people. No single man ruled absolutely. Kings were a thing of the past, banished from Roman soil forever, or so they thought. But Caesar had other plans. And here's the thing that makes his story so compelling. He didn't just stumble into greatness. Every move he made, every alliance he forged, every enemy he crushed was calculated with the precision of a master chess player. From his early days surviving political purges to his legendary conquests in Gaul, from his secret deals with Rome's most powerful men to that fateful moment when he crossed the Rubicon River and declared war on his own government. This is the story of a man who looked at the most powerful republic in history and said, "I can do better." And the terrifying part? He was probably right. Join us as we unravel the meteoric rise of Julius Caesar, the man who dared to defy Rome itself. We'll explore the brilliant strategies, the shocking betrayals, and the moments of sheer audacity that transformed an ambitious young politician into the most powerful man in the ancient world. Stay until the end, and you'll discover how his legacy still echoes through the corridors of power today, influencing leaders and shaping nations more than 2,000 years after his death. Don't forget to like this video if you're ready to dive into one of history's most captivating tales, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more epic journeys into antiquity. Trust me, Caesar's story is just getting started, and what comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, ambition, and the price of greatness. Now, let's rewind to the beginning. Gaius Julius Caesar was born on July 13th, around 100 years before Christ, into what should have been privilege and power. The Julii family was ancient Roman nobility, and Caesar would often boast that his bloodline traced back to the goddess Venus herself. Imagine that confidence, telling people your great-great-grandmother was the goddess of love and beauty. But here's the catch that makes Caesar's story so compelling. Despite this divine ancestry claim, his family was politically broke. Think about it this way. The Julii were like Hollywood royalty who'd lost their fortune. They had the name, they had the pedigree, but they didn't have the influence or the wealth that really mattered in Roman politics. Caesar's father had never even made it to consul, the highest office in Rome. So young Caesar grew up understanding a harsh truth. Noble blood meant nothing without power to back it up. But fate had a way of testing Caesar early. When he was just a teenager, Rome was torn apart by a brutal civil war between 2 military strongmen, Marius and Sulla. Marius was Caesar's uncle by marriage, which put the young man in a very dangerous position. When Sulla emerged victorious, he began what historians call the purges, basically a systematic elimination of his enemies and their families. Caesar was marked for death. At barely 18 years old, he was already on a dictator's hit list. Most teenagers would have panicked, begged for mercy, or hidden in their rooms. Not Caesar. He did something that would become his trademark throughout his life. He turned a crisis into an opportunity. Instead of cowering, he fled Rome and joined the army in Asia Minor. This wasn't just running away, it was strategic repositioning. While in exile, Caesar caught the attention of Marcus Thermus, the governor of Asia. who awarded him the civic crown, Rome's highest military honor, for saving a fellow soldier's life during the siege of Mytilene. Picture this: a teenager, supposedly running for his life, ends up becoming a war hero. That's vintage Caesar right there. But the most telling story from Caesar's youth happened during his journey to Rhodes, where he planned to study rhetoric and oratory. Now, here's where things get absolutely wild. Pirates captured Caesar's ship, but instead of trembling in fear like any normal person would, Caesar was genuinely offended by their ransom demand. They wanted 20 talents of silver. Caesar laughed in their faces and told them they clearly didn't know who they were dealing with. He insisted they raise the ransom to 50 talents because 20 was insulting to a man of his stature. Think about that audacity. He's literally a prisoner, and he's negotiating his ransom upward because his ego won't let him be ransomed cheaply. But it gets better. During his captivity, Caesar treated the pirates like his personal servants. He demanded they keep quiet when he wanted to sleep. He made them listen to his speeches and poems, and when they didn't applaud enthusiastically enough, he'd call them barbarians to their faces. The pirates thought this young Roman was hilarious. They had no idea they were dealing with a future master of the world. Caesar would joke with them, saying that once he was free, he'd come back and crucify them all. The pirates laughed. Caesar wasn't joking. When the ransom was paid and Caesar was released, he immediately went to the nearest Roman naval base, gathered a fleet, hunted down those pirates, and did exactly what he promised. He crucified every single one of them. However, showing a mercy that was unusual for the time, he had their throats cut first to spare them the prolonged agony of crucifixion. Even in revenge, Caesar was calculating, brutal enough to keep his word, merciful enough to seem civilized. This pirate episode reveals everything you need to know about young Caesar's character. His unshakable confidence, his ability to charm even his enemies, his long memory for both slights and promises, and his understanding that reputation was everything in the ancient world. After his adventures with the pirates, Caesar finally made it to Rhodes, where he studied under Apollonius Molon, the greatest orator of his generation. This wasn't just academic study. This was Caesar learning the art of persuasion that would later make him one of Rome's most compelling speakers. In Roman politics, the ability to sway a crowd with words was just as important as the ability to command an army. When Caesar finally returned to Rome, he made a crucial political choice that would define his entire career. Rome's political system was divided into two camps: the Optimates, who represented the traditional aristocratic interests and wanted to preserve the old way of doing things, and the Populares, who championed reforms and appealed directly to the common people for support. Caesar chose the Populares, and this decision was pure genius. Remember, he came from a noble family with no real political clout. The Optimates would never fully accept him because he lacked the wealth and connections of Rome's true elite. But the Populares offered him a path to power through popular appeal. Caesar understood that in a republic, even one dominated by the wealthy, the masses still had votes. He began his political career by taking on cases that other young lawyers wouldn't touch, defending people who had been wronged by corrupt governors and powerful officials. This wasn't just about justice. It was about building a reputation as the champion of the underdog. Every case he won, every corrupt official he exposed, added to his growing fame among ordinary Romans. Caesar was learning the most important lesson of his life. In politics, it's not just about who you know, it's about who knows you. And he was making sure that everyone in Rome knew the name Gaius Julius Caesar. By the time Caesar reached his 40s, he had mastered Roman politics, but he understood something crucial. In Rome, real power came from military success. The greatest politicians were also the greatest generals. So when the opportunity arose to become governor of Gaul in 58 years before Christ, Caesar didn't just see it as another political appointment. He saw it as his ticket to immortality. But here's what makes Caesar's Gallic campaigns so fascinating. They weren't just military conquests. They were the ancient world's first great propaganda campaign. Caesar didn't just fight wars, he wrote about them. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars became instant bestsellers back in Rome. And here's the genius part. Caesar wrote about himself in the third person, as if he were a neutral historian documenting these incredible achievements. Imagine if a modern general wrote his own war memoirs but pretended to be an objective journalist. General Smith courageously led his troops to victory, displaying tactical brilliance that historians will study for centuries. That's essentially what Caesar did, except he pulled it off so masterfully that people still read his commentaries in schools today, 2,000 years later. But were these commentaries accurate history or masterful propaganda? The answer is probably both. Caesar was undoubtedly a military genius, but he also knew how to tell a story. Every victory was described in vivid detail, every challenge made to seem insurmountable, until Caesar's brilliance saved the day. He turned his military campaigns into page-turning adventure stories with himself as the hero. The scale of Caesar's Gallic conquest was absolutely staggering. We're talking about 8 years of continuous warfare across what is now France, Belgium, parts of Germany, and even brief expeditions to Britain. Caesar claimed to have fought 3 million Gauls, killed 1 million, and enslaved another million. Even if these numbers are exaggerated, and they probably are, the scope of his conquest was unprecedented. Let me paint you a picture of just how ruthless Caesar could be. In 52 years before Christ, he faced his greatest challenge, a massive Gallic rebellion led by a charismatic young chief named Vercingetorix. This wasn't just another tribal skirmish. This was a coordinated uprising of virtually all the Gallic tribes united against Rome. The climax came at a hilltop fortress called Alesia. Vercingetorix had gathered his army there, thinking the high ground and strong walls would protect them. But Caesar did something that still amazes military historians today. He built not one, but 2 complete rings of fortifications around Alesia. The inner ring trapped the Gauls inside the fortress. The outer ring protected Caesar's army from the massive Gallic relief force that was marching to rescue Vercingetorix. Picture this. Caesar's legions were literally caught between 2 enemy armies, one inside Alesia and one approaching from outside. Most generals would have retreated. Caesar turned it into his greatest victory. When the relief army attacked his outer fortifications, Caesar personally led a cavalry charge that shattered the Gallic forces. Vercingetorix, seeing his people's cause was lost, made one of history's most dramatic surrenders. He put on his finest armor, rode out of Alesia alone, and threw his weapons at Caesar's feet in front of both armies. The aftermath was brutal, even by ancient standards. Caesar had Vercingetorix dragged back to Rome in chains, where he was displayed in Caesar's triumph parade and then executed. The surviving Gauls were sold into slavery by the thousands. This wasn't just conquest, it was the complete destruction of Gallic independence. But here's what's truly remarkable. Caesar's soldiers didn't just fear him, they loved him. He shared their dangers, ate their food, and made sure they got rich from the plunder of conquest. Caesar understood that loyalty bought with gold and respect was stronger than loyalty enforced by fear. His legions would follow him anywhere, and soon they would have to. Because back in Rome, the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Caesar's consulship was ending, and his enemies in the Senate were sharpening their knives. They passed laws stripping him of his command and ordering him to return to Rome as a private citizen. This might sound reasonable, but Caesar knew it was a death sentence. The moment he lost his legal immunity as a governor, his political enemies would destroy him with trumped-up charges. So Caesar faced the most momentous decision of his life. He could obey the Senate, return to Rome defenseless, and watch his career and probably his life end in disgrace. Or he could do something that no Roman general had done in living memory, march his army against Rome itself. The point of no return was a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. Roman law was crystal clear. No general could bring his army south of this river without Senate approval. To cross the Rubicon with his legions was to declare war on the Roman Republic itself. On a cold January night in 49 years before Christ, Caesar stood on the banks of the Rubicon with his most trusted officers. According to legend, He hesitated for hours, knowing that once he took this step, there would be no going back. Finally, as dawn broke, Caesar made his choice. "Alea iacta est," he declared. "The die is cast." And with those words, Caesar led his army across a tiny river and changed the course of human history. The Roman Republic, which had stood for nearly 5 centuries, began its death spiral in that moment. But Caesar wasn't thinking about republics or constitutions. He was thinking about survival, about power, and about destiny. The civil war that followed would rage for years, pitting Caesar against Pompey the Great, the Senate's chosen champion and Caesar's former ally. But as Caesar's legions marched south toward Rome, one thing became crystal clear. The boy who had once been marked for death by Sulla had become something far more dangerous than any dictator Rome had ever known. He had become inevitable. But let's rewind a bit, because to understand how Caesar became so powerful that he could defy the entire Roman Republic, we need to talk about the most secret and influential political deal in ancient history: the First Triumvirate. Picture this. It's around 60 years before Christ, and Roman politics has become a brutal game where only the strongest survive. 3 men realized that instead of destroying each other, they could divide the entire Roman world among themselves. These weren't just any 3 men. They were the most powerful individuals in the known world. First, there was Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, the man who had conquered the East and brought unimaginable wealth back to Rome. Then there was Marcus Licinius Crassus, quite possibly the richest man who ever lived. We're talking about someone so wealthy that he owned his own private fire department and would buy burning buildings for cheap, then put out the fires and resell them at massive profits. And finally, there was our ambitious young Caesar, who brought something equally valuable to this partnership: his political cunning and his ability to win over the common people. Here's what makes this alliance so fascinating. It was completely secret. In public, these 3 men often criticized each other, voted against each other's proposals, and seemed like rivals. But behind closed doors, they had essentially carved up the Roman Empire like a pizza. Pompey got his military commands in the east, Crassus got his business deals, and eventually his disastrous campaign in Persia, and Caesar got his consulship, and later his governorship of Gaul. The genius of this arrangement was that it bypassed the entire Roman political system. The Senate, which was supposed to be the governing body of the Republic, became irrelevant overnight. Why? Because these 3 men controlled the armies, the money, and the popular support. They didn't need to convince hundreds of senators to support their policies. They just needed to convince each other. But here's the thing about secret alliances between ambitious men. They're only as strong as mutual benefit makes them. And the First Triumvirate began to crack almost immediately. The first major fracture came when Crassus, jealous of the military glory that Pompey and Caesar were earning, decided he needed his own great conquest. So he launched an invasion of Persia, the one superpower that Rome had never been able to defeat. The result was catastrophic. Crassus and his entire army were annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 years before Christ. According to legend, the Persians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat, mocking his legendary greed. With Crassus dead, the triumvirate became a rivalry between 2 titans, Caesar and Pompey. And this is where things get really interesting, because their relationship was both political and deeply personal. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter Julia, and by all accounts, it was a genuine love match despite being a political arrangement. But when Julia died in childbirth in 54 years before Christ, the last personal bond between these 2 powerful men was severed. Now, before we continue with this epic political showdown, I have to ask, what would you do if you were kidnapped by pirates like young Caesar was? Would you have the audacity to negotiate your ransom upward because you felt insulted? Let us know in the comments below. And if you're enjoying Caesar's incredible story of ambition and audacity so far, smash that like button and subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more epic tales from the ancient world. Now back to our story. As Caesar's victories in Gaul made him more famous and powerful, Pompey began to feel threatened. The student was surpassing the master, and Pompey didn't like it one bit. The Senate, seeing an opportunity to play these two giants against each other, began courting Pompey as their champion against Caesar. This led to the civil war we mentioned earlier. But here's what's truly remarkable. Caesar didn't just win this war, he won it so decisively and so quickly that it shocked the ancient world. Pompey, who had never lost a campaign, was outmaneuvered at every turn. The climactic battle came at Pharsalus in Greece in 48 years before Christ, where Caesar's veteran legions, outnumbered 2-1, completely destroyed Pompey's larger army. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping to find sanctuary there, but the Egyptians, wanting to curry favor with the obvious winner, murdered him as he stepped onto their shore. When Caesar arrived in Egypt and was presented with Pompey's head, he reportedly wept. Whether these tears were genuine grief for his former ally or crocodile tears for political effect, we'll never know. But it was a masterful piece of theater. With Pompey dead and his supporters scattered, Caesar found himself in a position that no Roman had held since the kings were expelled 5 centuries earlier. He was the undisputed master of the Roman world. And this is where Caesar faced his greatest challenge, not on the battlefield, but in the halls of power. How do you govern an empire that has been a republic for 500 years? How do you transform a system built on shared power into one where you hold absolute authority? Caesar's solution was brilliant and terrifying in equal measure. He didn't abolish the republic. That would have caused immediate revolt. Instead, he kept all the traditional offices and institutions, but made sure that he controlled them completely. He was consul, dictator, Pontifex Maximus, and held about half a dozen other titles simultaneously. He was, in effect, a one-man government. But Caesar wasn't content with just political power. He understood something that many dictators miss. To truly transform a society, you have to change how people think about time itself. So Caesar reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor modifications, we still use today. Think about that. Every time you check the date, you're using a system created by Julius Caesar. He also launched massive public works projects, expanding the Forum, building new theaters and temples, and planning projects that wouldn't be completed until long after his death. Caesar was literally reshaping the physical landscape of Rome to match his vision of what the empire should be. And then there were the honors. Caesar was granted the right to wear triumphal dress in public, his statue was placed in temples alongside the gods, and he was given the title Father of the Fatherland. Some even whispered that he wanted to be crowned king, though Caesar always publicly denied this. But here's the question that haunted every Roman, from the humblest plebeian to the most powerful senator. Was Caesar Rome's savior or its destroyer? On one hand, he had brought peace after decades of civil war. He was implementing reforms that helped ordinary citizens, and he was making Rome stronger and more prosperous than ever before. On the other hand, he had destroyed the republic that Romans had cherished for 5 centuries. The Senate, once the most powerful governing body in the world, had been reduced to a rubber stamp for Caesar's decisions. The complex system of checks and balances that had made Rome great had been replaced by the will of one man. The senators looked at Caesar and saw the death of everything they held sacred. Caesar looked at the Senate and saw a corrupt, inefficient institution that had failed Rome. Both sides believed they were fighting for Rome's soul. The tragedy is that they were both probably right. By 44 years before Christ, Caesar had been the undisputed master of Rome for nearly 4 years. He seemed untouchable, almost godlike in his power and achievements. But there's an old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and perhaps more dangerously, it makes you careless about the very real human emotions of those around you. The conspiracy against Caesar didn't begin with a grand political movement or a popular uprising. It started with whispered conversations between a handful of senators who felt that their beloved republic was dying a slow death under Caesar's rule. These weren't foreign enemies or ambitious rivals. These were men who had served alongside Caesar, men who had benefited from his generosity, men who should have been his most loyal supporters. At the heart of this conspiracy was Marcus Junius Brutus, and his story is perhaps the most tragic of all. Brutus wasn't just any senator. He was Caesar's protege, almost like a son to him. Caesar had shown Brutus incredible favor, promoting his career, trusting him with important positions, and some even whispered that Brutus might actually be Caesar's biological son from an affair with Brutus's mother years earlier. But Brutus came from a family with a legendary reputation. His ancestor, the first Brutus, had been one of the founders of the Roman Republic after expelling the last king over 400 years earlier. The weight of that legacy hung heavy on young Brutus's shoulders. Every day, as he watched Caesar accumulate more power and more honors, he felt like he was betraying everything his family had stood for. The other key conspirator was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man with a very different motivation. While Brutus was driven by idealistic notions of republican virtue, Cassius was motivated by cold, hard political calculation and personal resentment. He had been passed over for positions he felt he deserved, and he saw Caesar's growing power as a threat to the traditional senatorial class that he represented. Here's what's fascinating about this conspiracy. It grew like a cancer through the Roman elite. Eventually, about 60 senators were involved in the plot. 60 men. Think about that. This wasn't a small cabal of malcontents. This was a significant portion of Rome's governing class united in their belief that Caesar had to die. The conspirators called themselves the Liberators, convinced that they were saving the Republic from tyranny. But they faced a crucial problem. How do you kill the most powerful man in the world when he's surrounded by loyal guards and devoted supporters? The solution came from Caesar's own hubris. In the months leading up to his assassination, Caesar had begun dismissing his personal bodyguard, claiming that a leader who needed protection from his own people wasn't worthy of leadership. It was a noble sentiment that would prove fatal. The conspirators chose the Ides of March, March 15th, for their deed. The Senate was scheduled to meet in the theater of Pompey, and Caesar would be attending. The irony was perfect. They would kill Caesar in a building named after his greatest rival, the man he had defeated to become dictator. Now here's where history gets mixed up with legend, because the story you probably know about Caesar's death comes more from Shakespeare than from actual historical records. But let me tell you what we think really happened on that fateful morning. Caesar had been warned. A soothsayer had told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia had terrible nightmares and begged him not to go to the Senate that day. Even some of his closest advisors suggested he postpone the meeting. But Caesar, displaying the same confidence that had carried him through decades of battles and political struggles, decided to go anyway. As Caesar approached the theater of Pompey, one of the conspirators, a man named Artemidorus, tried to hand him a scroll that detailed the entire plot. But Caesar, surrounded by other senators and petitioners, never got the chance to read it. History might have been completely different if Caesar had taken 30 seconds to read that warning. Inside the theater, the conspirators had positioned themselves strategically around Caesar's chair. The plan was simple but required perfect coordination. They would surround Caesar under the pretense of presenting a petition, then strike simultaneously. It started when a senator named Tullius Cimber approached Caesar with a petition to recall his exiled brother. When Caesar dismissed the request, Cimber grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it down from his shoulders. This was the signal. In an instant, the conspirators closed in. The first blow came from Casca, striking Caesar in the shoulder. Then chaos erupted. 60 senators, many of them holding daggers, pressed forward. Caesar fought back at first. He was still a strong man in his 50s, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. According to witnesses, he managed to wound several attackers with his stylus, the metal pen used for writing. But then, Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, dagger in hand. This is the moment that has echoed through history. The ancient sources don't agree on Caesar's exact words. Some say he said nothing, others record different phrases. But the sentiment that Shakespeare captured with "Et tu, Brute," and "you, Brutus," represents the devastating emotional blow that broke Caesar's will to fight. When Caesar realized that even his beloved Brutus had turned against him, he stopped fighting. He pulled his toga over his head so that he wouldn't have to see his killers, and according to tradition, he made sure to arrange his clothing so that he would die with dignity. Even in his final moments, Caesar was thinking about his image and his legacy. The conspirators struck Caesar 23 times, though the physician who examined his body later said that only one wound would have been fatal. The great Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome, the man who had seemed invincible, died at the foot of a statue of Pompey, his blood pooling on the marble floor of the theater. The irony was brutal and perfect. Caesar had defeated Pompey in life, but in death, he fell literally at his rival's feet. But here's the thing that the conspirators never understood. Killing Caesar didn't save the Republic. In fact, it doomed it. The senators who called themselves liberators had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought that once Caesar was dead, the Roman Republic would magically return to its old ways. They had no plan for what came next. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The people of Rome, rather than celebrating their liberation from tyranny, were shocked and angry. Caesar had been popular with the masses, and his death left a power vacuum that nobody was prepared to fill. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, seized the initiative. In one of history's greatest pieces of political theater, Antony delivered a funeral oration over Caesar's body that turned the Roman people against the conspirators. He displayed Caesar's bloody toga, pointed out each tear made by the assassin's daggers, and read Caesar's will, which left generous gifts to every Roman citizen and donated his private gardens to the city for public use. The crowd went wild with grief and rage. They hunted the conspirators through the streets of Rome, forcing Brutus, Cassius, and the others to flee the city. The liberators had succeeded in killing Caesar, but they had lost Rome in the process. But the real winner in this tragedy wasn't Mark Antony. It was a young man that almost nobody took seriously at first. Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, Gaius Octavius, who would later become known as Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Octavian was only 18 when Caesar died, but he had inherited something more valuable than money or armies. He had inherited Caesar's name, and in the Roman world, names carried power. By law, Octavian became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and he used that name like a weapon. Over the next 13 years, Octavian would systematically destroy everyone who stood in his way. He formed alliances when it suited him, then broke them when they didn't. He defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. He hunted down the surviving conspirators. Brutus and Cassius both committed suicide rather than face capture. And then, in 27 years before Christ, Octavian achieved what Julius Caesar never could. He became the first Roman emperor, taking the name Augustus, which means the revered one. He ruled for over 40 years, transforming Rome from a war-torn republic into a stable, prosperous empire that would last for centuries. The conspirators who thought they were saving the republic by killing Caesar had actually guaranteed its destruction. They had shown that violence was an acceptable solution to political problems, and they had created the chaos that allowed Augustus to seize absolute power with the full support of the Roman people. Julius Caesar's greatest victory wasn't any of his military conquests. It was that his death accomplished what his life couldn't. It convinced the Romans that they needed an emperor. 2,000 years have passed since Julius Caesar's assassination, yet his shadow still looms over our world in ways that would probably astonish even him. Think about this. Every time a political leader promises to cross the Rubicon on a difficult decision, every time someone warns about the Ides of March, every time we use the word Tsar or Kaiser, we're invoking the memory of a man who died over 2 millennia ago. That's not just historical influence, that's immortality. But Caesar's legacy goes far deeper than catchphrases and metaphors. He created the blueprint for absolute power that ambitious leaders have been copying ever since. And here's what's truly remarkable. This blueprint works just as well in the modern world as it did in ancient Rome. Let's start with something that might surprise you. The very word emperor comes from the Latin imperator, which was one of Caesar's titles. But it gets even more direct than that. The German word Kaiser and the Russian word Tsar are both literally derived from Caesar. For over 1,500 years after his death, rulers across Europe were still claiming legitimacy by connecting themselves to Julius Caesar's name. Think about that for a moment. Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of the French, consciously modeling himself on the Roman emperors who followed Caesar. Adolf Hitler called his regime the Third Reich, claiming it was the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, which itself claimed descent from Caesar's Rome. Even in the 20th century, dictators were still using Caesar's playbook to justify their power. But what exactly is this playbook? How did Caesar create a template for autocracy that has proven so enduring? First, Caesar understood that successful dictators don't abolish existing institutions. They capture them. When Caesar became dictator, he didn't dissolve the Senate or eliminate the consulship. Instead, he made sure that these traditional offices were filled with his supporters and operated according to his will. The forms of the republic remained, but the substance was completely transformed. This is a pattern we've seen repeated throughout history. Modern authoritarian leaders rarely declare themselves dictators outright. Instead, they work within existing democratic systems, gradually concentrating power while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy. They hold elections but make sure they can't lose. They preserve legislatures but ensure they rubber-stamp the leader's decisions. Second, Caesar pioneered the art of populist authoritarianism. He understood that the key to absolute power wasn't just controlling the elite. It was winning the love of the masses. Caesar's land reforms, his public games, his generous distributions of grain and money to the poor. These weren't just policies. They were political strategies designed to make ordinary Romans see him as their champion against a corrupt establishment. Again, this playbook has been used countless times throughout history. Authoritarian leaders often rise to power by positioning themselves as champions of the common people against corrupt elites, promising to restore greatness and provide security in exchange for freedom. Third, Caesar understood the power of spectacle and propaganda. His Gallic Wars commentaries weren't just military reports. They were carefully crafted public relations documents designed to build his legend. He understood that in politics, perception often matters more than reality. Modern dictators have taken this lesson to heart, using mass media, rallies, and carefully staged events to create an aura of invincibility and inevitability around their rule. The techniques have evolved, but the fundamental principle remains the same. Control the narrative, and you control the people. But perhaps Caesar's most enduring legacy is the way he normalized the idea that exceptional times require exceptional measures. Caesar justified his march on Rome by arguing that the Republic was broken, that traditional institutions had failed, and that only he could restore order and greatness. This argument, that democracy is too slow, too corrupt, too weak to handle serious challenges, has been used by every would-be dictator since. Now, let's talk about what Caesar's rise meant for Rome itself, because this is where his legacy becomes truly complex and controversial. On one hand, there's no denying that Caesar's transformation of Rome from republic to empire unleashed an unprecedented period of prosperity and expansion. Augustus, Caesar's heir, ushered in what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that lasted for over 2 centuries. During this time, the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent, stretching from Britain to the Persian Gulf, from the Rhine to the Sahara Desert. The infrastructure projects alone were staggering. Roman roads connected every corner of the empire. Roman aqueducts brought fresh water to millions of people. Roman law created a uniform system of justice that influenced legal systems for centuries to come. Literature, art, architecture, and philosophy flourished under imperial patronage. For hundreds of millions of people across 3 continents, Roman rule meant peace, prosperity, and order. But here's the question that haunts Caesar's legacy. Was this golden age worth the price that was paid for it? Because the cost was enormous. The Roman Republic, for all its flaws, had been built on the revolutionary idea that no single person should hold absolute power. The complex system of consuls, senators, and popular assemblies with their checks and balances had been designed to prevent any one individual from becoming a tyrant. This system had made Rome the most successful state in the ancient world, conquering an empire that stretched across the known world. Caesar's rise shattered this system forever. After him, Rome would be ruled by emperors for the next 500 years in the west and another 1,000 years in the east. The Roman people, who had once been citizens participating in their own government, became subjects dependent on the whims of their rulers. And here's what's truly tragic. Many of those later emperors were monsters. Caligula declared himself a god and may have made his horse a consul. Nero murdered his own mother and probably set fire to Rome for his own entertainment. Commodus turned the imperial palace into a brothel and forced senators to fight as gladiators for his amusement. The system that Caesar created had no mechanism for removing bad emperors except assassination or civil war. And both happened regularly, plunging the empire into chaos whenever an emperor died without a clear successor. So Caesar's legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can a society trade freedom for security and prosperity? The Romans under the early emperors lived in a more peaceful, more prosperous world than their republican ancestors. They had better roads, better buildings, better entertainment, and better protection from foreign enemies. But they had lost something precious, the right to choose their own leaders and shape their own destiny. This trade-off, security and prosperity versus freedom and self-governance, is Caesar's most enduring legacy. Every generation since has had to grapple with this dilemma, and we're still grappling with it today. Julius Caesar didn't just change Rome. He changed the fundamental relationship between rulers and the ruled. He showed that with enough charisma, enough military success, and enough popular support, one person could accumulate power that previous generations would have considered impossible. Whether that's a cautionary tale or an inspiring example depends entirely on where you stand. But there's no denying that Julius Caesar, a man who lived and died over 2,000 years ago, still shapes the world we live in today. And so we reach the end of one of history's most extraordinary stories. Julius Caesar's life reads like a masterpiece of ambition, brilliance, and ultimately tragic hubris. But here's what makes his story so haunting. It's not really about ancient Rome at all. It's about us. Think about it for a moment. Caesar's story is a mirror reflecting humanity's oldest and most dangerous dilemma. Power corrupts, but vision transforms. Every generation faces this same impossible question. Can greatness ever truly justify tyranny? Can the ends ever really justify the means? Caesar genuinely believed he was saving Rome. He looked at a crumbling republic torn apart by corruption, civil wars, and incompetent leadership, and he thought, I can fix this. And you know what? In many ways he did. His reforms fed the hungry, his conquests brought wealth, his vision created an empire that would last for centuries. But at what cost? Democracy died with him. The Senate became a puppet show. The voice of the people was silenced forever. Here's the chilling part. Caesar's playbook didn't die with him on the floor of the theater of Pompey. Throughout history, countless leaders have followed his exact same path. They've promised order in times of chaos, efficiency instead of messy democracy, greatness instead of ordinary governance. From Napoleon to modern dictators, they've all whispered the same seductive lie. Trust me with absolute power, and I'll make everything perfect. But here's what Caesar's story teaches us that we can never forget. The moment someone claims they alone can save the nation, that's precisely when we should be most afraid. The most dangerous tyrants aren't the obvious villains twirling their mustaches. They're the charismatic leaders who genuinely believe their own propaganda, who convince themselves that crushing freedom is actually saving it. And yet, we can't simply dismiss Caesar as a monster. That would be too easy, wouldn't it? The man who crossed the Rubicon was also the one who wept over Pompey's death, who showed mercy to his enemies, who genuinely loved Rome more than his own life. He was brilliant, complex, contradictory. In other words, thoroughly human. And that's what makes his story so eternally relevant. As we navigate our own era of upheaval, with democracies under strain and strong men rising around the world, Caesar's ghost whispers a warning across the centuries. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but my friends, it absolutely rhymes. The patterns are always the same: economic crisis, social division, fear of the future, and then the arrival of someone promising simple solutions to complex problems. So the next time you hear a leader say they alone can fix everything, remember Caesar. Remember that the road to tyranny is always paved with good intentions and popular approval. Remember that republics die not with a bang, but with applause. Caesar's legacy is paradoxical. He destroyed the Roman Republic, but his name became synonymous with imperial power for 2,000 years. Kaiser, Czar, Caesar, they all echo his name. He lost his life, but won immortality. He failed to save the Republic, but created an empire that shaped the world. Maybe that's the most human thing about Julius Caesar's story. Like all of us, he was neither pure hero nor pure villain. He was a man who reached for greatness and grasped it, only to discover that the price of absolute power is absolute isolation. In the end, surrounded by the blood of his enemies and the betrayal of his friends, Caesar learned what we all must learn: that no one, no matter how brilliant or well-intentioned, should ever hold the fate of a nation in their hands alone. If you were captivated by Caesar's incredible rise and tragic fall, smash that like button and share this with fellow history lovers who understand that the past isn't just entertainment, it's instruction. Subscribe to Imperium Chronicles for more journeys into the stories that shaped our world, because understanding yesterday is the key to surviving tomorrow. Until next time, remember Caesar's own words as he stepped into the river that would change everything. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. But unlike Caesar, we still have the power to choose which side it lands on. History is watching. What will your choice be?